So, colleagues, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's FACE departmental seminar. And today's presenter is Professor Tasleem Ras, who has been at UCT since 2015. But I know previously he was already involved in the rural training platform in Friedenberg. Um, and is also a proud UCT graduate. Many graduations indeed. Most recently, we celebrated his PhD graduation, um, and so his many other roles and hats that he carries includes being the postgraduate programs convener for our division of family medicine. He is also very involved with the departmental, faculty, and university and national levels in academic governance within the disciplines of family medicine and in the postgraduate training space. He's also a recognized leader in medical specialist training. So as an educationalist, he is really growing his niche contribution to the field. But he's also quite involved with health system strengthening, and most recently also a part of a large project on enhancing access to cancer care and diagnosis, especially in primary care. And he serves on various boards and councils. At departmental level, he leads and chairs the departmental postgraduate teaching and learning committee. And through that, he's also part of the executive committee of the department. He's also an active member and previous deputy chair of the faculty specialist training committee. And he is on the board and council member of the South African Academy of Family Practitioners, which is our national academy for our discipline. And he's on the editorial board of the Academy's official journal, the South African Family Practice Journal. And also recently he has been one of 4 editors of the revised South African Family Practice Manual, which is now its 4th iteration and a seminal text used in family medicine and primary care education, both nationally and regionally. He is very involved also, as I said, in the education space, also from a governance and ASCII writing group chair within the colleges of family physicians, and is leading work also nationally around workplace-based assessment and contributing on developing entrustable professional activities in the discipline of family medicine, but also within the wider colleges of medicine of South Africa. So it really is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, friend, and collaborator par excellence, Tasleem Ras, and we really look forward to your presentation today, in which you will share the work from your doctoral research. So over to you, Tasleem.
Thanks, Klaus. Klaus has such a way with words. Whenever he introduces someone, I think, well, I'd like to meet that person. So, Klaus, when you meet that guy you just introduced, please, I need an intro. Just let me know if you can see my slides.
Not. There we go. We can see. Thank you very much.
All right. Wonderful. So the topic of my talk is reimagining clinician-patient relationships in an African context. And I'm going to speak from an educational perspective. I must give credit to my 2 super supervisors, Susan and Steve, who were with me from day one. So this project represents my PhD journey over the last, I think I enrolled for the first time in 2017, had some excitement around 2020 with COVID, and then finally submitted for examination last year, and I graduated a few weeks ago. So we have to give credit where credit is due. So Susan and Steve, not on the call, but thank you very much. So the problem with clinician-patient relationships is what we're going to be talking about in a little bit of, not detail, but I'm going to unpack some of my realities as a clinician. I'm then going to give some kind of an introduction to the educational context, review some of the literature, and then talk about the actual research that we did. So Africa remains one of the most unequal society on earth. The latest Gini coefficient 2022 showed that we had a Gini coefficient of 0.63, largely due to a very low, high unemployment rate, poor throughput rate in our secondary education system, and in the unemployability of people with low skills. What it means is that access to education, housing, health, and work opportunities are limited for a very large percentage of the population. In addition to that, we're probably sitting on one of the most extensive mental health crises that our profession has ever faced. The amount of people suffering from burnout who are dropping out of the medical profession. And we know that the rates of suicide amongst health professionals internationally is the highest of all professions. In South Africa, in addition to this very large wealth gap, we have huge language and cultural barriers. Oftentimes, clinicians, and let me speak about doctors in this audience. Doctors don't come from the communities which they are serving when they're working in underserved areas. And so when language is not commonly shared between the doctor and the patient, the implication is that there are multiple other cultural barriers and cultural blind spots that exist, which impact on how the doctor starts to engage with patients and with communities. And what emerges out of this huge wealth gap is that between 70 and 75% of our population is uninsured, which means that they're dependent on our state-sponsored health facilities. We all know these stats. So the reality is that the patients who are populating our health facilities are juxtaposed against these relatively affluent group of doctors, often who come from middle-class communities, who have very little in common in terms of a lived experience with the communities and the patients that they serve. So that's the social reality that doctors are faced with, doctors and patients are faced with in trying to establish some type of relationship in our community-based facilities. I want to just talk for a few minutes, or 1 or 2 minutes, about family medicine in South Africa. It's a relatively new discipline. Even though there's been moves afoot for several years, several decades in terms of the postgraduate space, but family medicine as a medical specialty is only since 2007. Currently, we have 9 postgraduate training centers across the country, and approximately 1,200 registered family physicians, with an estimated shortfall of about 10,000 family physicians if we consider the World Health Organization doctor-to-patient ratio as a target. What informs our curriculum on clinician-patient relationships? I think a lot of our literature focuses on some aspects of the clinician-patient relationship, but not on all aspects. And so I'll touch on those which are touched upon within our literature. Outside of our curriculum, there have been some writings about clinicians and patients, and I particularly mentioned Michel Foucault, who described this huge power imbalance in what he coined as the medical gaze, where the knowledgeable doctor, who is this austere, mostly men, well, almost entirely men in the European context, would be sitting, and sick people would come to them as some type of a in a way which honored and established the hierarchy. And so the knowledge system around the traditional doctor was very much intertwined with this skewed power dynamic. It translates into modern medical practice in many ways. Around the 1950s, people started saying, but hang on, when we only look at the biomedical experiences of patients, we start missing that a lot of their physical symptoms are lost. A lot of their physical symptoms are not explained within the biomedical framework. And so we saw the rise of psychosocial and patient-centered care, essentially from within the psychoanalytic discipline. And I mentioned the two balance, Michael and Enid, Carl Rogers and Engel, as forerunners of exploring the psychosocial aspects of patients' experience. And it's out of this initial work from the 1950s and 60s that family medicine emerged as a distinct academic discipline in the 1970s, primarily framed within the biopsychosocial model. That time in a primary care environment. In South Africa, we've translated this into a district care environment. Along with this reconceptualization of what at the time was general practice, there was also a need for an ethical framework which spoke to multiple different contexts. And up to that time, ethics was largely driven by the dominant philosophical mindset of the day. And so in the late 1970s, Beauchamp and Childress, with the landmark publication, outlined the postmodern approach to medical ethics that we still use today for the so-called principlist approach. Kimantri Moodley, after she did a PhD on this at UCT, and now heads up ethics unit at Stellenbosch University, translated this into an African context. Then also multiple perspectives on the role of empathy. And these are contextually rich descriptions coming from different parts of the world. Other aspects of the clinician-patient relationship that has been explored within the literature are this notion of identity construction of professionals, of health professionals, and some people call them within the literature the pedagogies of being. How do we teach about professional identity formation? And then the last domain to be mentioned are the medical and health humanities, which are gaining stronger and stronger traction locally and has already gained a fair amount of traction internationally. So why I'm summarizing this literature is because just to give a sense of the breadth that the current literature engages with, also noting that the voice of African scholarship is sadly lacking and soft in all of these publications. And so I would argue that there's a very strong humanizing trend in the literature from the 1960s, 1950s onwards. Contextually rich, particularly from a global north perspective, philosophically dense, once again from a global north perspective. And my question that I asked of myself was, what do we as African scholars, what have we contributed, and what can we still contribute to this humanizing trend within health science education? And so grappling with that broader question, I asked these two specific research questions. First one was, how do students experience deep perceptual learning about clinician-patient relationships in our contexts? And I've described the context, the one of where the doctors and the patients typically are quite far from each other, language, culture, socioeconomics, etc. And the second is, can we synthesize a theory of learning about this clinician-patient relationship in an African context from locally generated data, bearing in mind that the entirety of the biopsychosocial framework that we're using at the moment, which frames how we engage and teach about clinician-patient relationships within family medicine, the entirety of that was gleaned from data sources outside of Africa and more specifically in the global north. Even more specifically than that, in Canada and in the UK. I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, and if there are questions, we can come back to it. But it had the conceptual framework that I used consisted of 3 key elements. The one was to describe the process of learning, and because we were looking at deep perceptual shifts from one worldview to another about our specific phenomenon, which was clinician-patient relationships, I used a transformative learning theory as described by Jack Meserow, who is a critical educational theorist. Very interesting background to how he developed this theory. And because I wanted to understand relationships and interconnectedness between people in a context-specific manner, I leaned very heavily on the work by John Mbiti, who was the late John Mbiti, who was a Kenyan theologian and philosopher. Was one of the first academics to write quite strongly about Ubuntu. And then, because of the power dynamic that pre-exists my study and that has been existent within medical hierarchy for hundreds of years, I leaned on Michel Foucault and his analysis of power in his description, let me leave that word out, in his description of the medical gaze. And it was through, so I constructed a conceptual framework using these 3 diverse perspectives. And so all of the analysis was done through this lens. So we basically had 3 cohorts that we collected data from. We had a patient cohort, and the data was collected by direct interview immediately after the consultations with doctors, because we wanted to have a fresh perspective on the experiences with those doctors. We collected data from our students who were, I'll describe that in a moment, but they were essentially postgraduate students in family medicine, either doing the postgrad diploma or who were doing an MEd. And then we collected data from educators, excuse me, who were involved in educating students in the postgraduate space. The method of analysis was both inductive and deductive. Deductive in the sense that we were looking for evidence that students were learning within the transformative learning framework, and then inductive in the sense that we were looking for new themes that emerged de novo in relation to interconnectedness and power. So the context is our typical day hospitals and small hospitals across Metro West. We had postgrad diploma students who were doctors and nurses, and the MA students obviously are only nurses. Only doctors. And then we ran some modules on the side. Most of the work that they did was in the clinic. We relied quite heavily on reflective learning. So students would experience clinical work. We'd then bring them back into the classroom once a week. And the core teaching would be in a reflective session, which built on the clinical experience. Very little in the form of didactic teaching. Most of the learning was in the form of the developing of critical reflection ability, and then group discussion with guided reflection by the facilitator. So it foregrounded experience within the clinical's space as our substrate for learning, rather than foregrounding a text as the substrate for learning. And that's an important philosophical departure that I came to realize and appreciate as we were analyzing the data. So broadly speaking, our findings in relation to our patient cohort were three key themes that emerged from that. The first was that of validating patienthood. The second was of validating personhood, and there's a difference between the two. And the third, which was a welcome and very surprising element, was that patients as critical agents, and I'll speak to that in a moment. I'm not going to read the quotes. I'm sure you guys can read it for yourselves. But in terms of validating patienthood, there were two elements. The one was being heard. Oftentimes, patients felt as if their stories were not being listened to. So their stories weren't important. And being heard became something which they really valued. And then secondly, being examined. In the one instance, like if you look at the quote there, they said, but when I attended this doctor, they checked my body, they asked everything. Now that checking of the body was a recurring comment that patients reported as a strongly validating statement. And so within the clinical space, the social role that the patient adopts is this role of patienthood. They're a person outside. Within that space, they're a patient. And so when we truly listen to these stories and validate that by doing investigations or examining them or attending to their suffering, that validates the role. They haven't wasted their time. They didn't take a taxi that cost X amount of money. They didn't hitchhike for 30 kilometers for nothing. You or us as the medical practitioners, the clinicians, are validating the role that they've adopted for that 2 or 3 or 4 hours that they are in the medical facility. The second broad theme relates to personhood being validated. Now, I want to draw a distinction between patienthood as a social role and personhood as a way of being, valued as a person within the context of the clinician-patient encounter. And there were two things that fed into this sense that patients were feeling valued as human beings. The first was the attention to the emotional reality that existed within the clinical encounter. And patients reported on ways that clinicians were doing things. And if you look at the quote on the right, it says that because it felt like the first time that I had a doctor examine me like he had, so that's describing the way that he had been examined, and the way he spoke to me, the way he asked me the questions, I was not even afraid to answer the questions. The way he looked me in the eye, even the way he touched me, comfortable. Yes, he made me feel very, very comfortable. So there was this abiding notion that the way in which the clinician carried him or herself, from the moment that the patient walked into the room, there was this very rapid intuitive assessment, which was then retested and retested and retested throughout the clinical encounter, whether this was 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. And the patient developed a hypothesis early on that this is the type of person that this clinician is, and then tested that hypothesis repeatedly and then made up their mind. So remembering that these interviews were immediately after their consultations. So what then emerges if the hypothesis that this clinician has my best interest in mind? What emerged from that was that this level of trust. In a different presentation, I have some of the quotes related to trust. It's quite interesting that there are two levels of trust that emerged in the data. The first was trusting the clinician as a professional, right? And that's the patient spoke to levels of comprehensiveness of the assessment. When they found that they were examined thoroughly, they were more likely willing to trust the clinician's assessment. That was the one. And the second thing which comes out of this ways of doing and being was this trust of the person, him or herself. One of the patients that we interviewed out in Crossroads CHC said that she felt that she could tell, and this was via an interpreter, she felt that she could tell the doctor almost anything because of the way in which the doctor had approached some of the questions. And in that interview, for example, we had uncovered some really intimate details that the patient shared with us. So there was a level of trust, two levels of trust. The one in the clinician's competence, and that competence was proven by the way in which the person examined and investigated the particular complaint. But then there was this other unspoken way of being that generated trust as a person. So there's trust in the professional and the trust in the person. There's two levels of trust that emerged in the data in our analysis. It was very interesting. And then the third thing was, the third theme that emerged from the patient data was this patient as a critical agent. So I constantly thought about patients as being disempowered, unengaged, and we would then need to almost drag them into the therapeutic process, convince them to take their medications, convince them to change their lives. And actually what emerged from the data is that this is a very, very intuitively aware group of people, almost without fail. And when I say without fail, I mean without fail, patients were able to make very astute observations and evaluations of the clinicians. And they weren't only making evaluations of what the clinician was saying, they were also making evaluations of the intentionality behind that. So, for example, in the quote there, you'll see the observation that I don't know why, because maybe he was being observed a lot, but to me, he did everything good. So there's on one level, there's a descriptive evaluation, and on the next, there's a little bit of inductive reasoning about why he did so well. Maybe it's because you were watching him that he did so well. And then the next level of the patient has been critical evaluator is if you look at the last sentence, this is the first time ever to be treated like that by a doctor. So they're using their past experiences to judge current experiences. Patients, and so on many levels, I was very surprised to find that patients were making such critical evaluations about the clinicians that they were engaging with. And if you understand how that feeds into this notion of personhood and trust, you understand how important that is. Patients are decision makers, without doubt. In some of the other quotes that are not shown here, clear indication that they want to be part of decision making. They want to be part, and like the one lady said who brought her disabled child, that you can't make a decision without me. This is about my child. I'm involved. So the doctors, whether they're at the specialist at Red Cross or at the facility I'm attending, can't make a decision without me being there. And then there's this notion of accountability, which is a loaded word. And in the context of this study, the accountability was traded. In the commodity that was used to trade was trust. So there were ways in which when patients trusted someone, they felt as if they could give them their secrets. But the accountability was, the trust was withheld. And this is how the patients held these clinicians to account. It was quite an interesting thing. We know that the HPCSA is created for accountability. We didn't ask the patients about the HPCSA. But we also know that there are some problems associated with the HPCSA. So this idea of accountability, you know, it's a complex idea that I would like to look at further in the future. The key findings for the students is that they found that they needed caring as well. They struggled with vulnerability. And then we described a clear process of perspective transformation for them. The sub-themes in caring for the carer was around finding meaning in their work, And what comes out of meaning is a sense of peace, meaning and purpose. Peace emanates from that. And then the struggle with vulnerability, and it's quite interesting that they viewed themselves as docile bodies. Now, the docile body is a Foucauldian term referring to a body which is part of a bigger system. And in the context of the bigger system, that body is unable to act on its own volition. It just does whatever the system tells it to do. And that story resonated quite strongly. I mean, that narrative came through quite strongly with these clinicians who were working within the system. I'll show you some quotes related to that. So when we think about docility and agency, what was quite interesting, it speaks directly to vulnerability. Oftentimes, clinicians felt disempowered when they described the roles within the system, and became something mechanical. I mean, healthcare for them became almost mechanical. If you look at the second text box, rather like a conveyor belt system. At the end of the day, there's this hollow feeling, and even though you push through the numbers, but you're just drained from that. So it's this just kind of, and I'm sure many of us who have worked have experienced this. On the flip side, when they considered a perspective transformation, so the first two quotes was when they were reflecting on the initial engagements with students at the beginning of the research process. At the end of the research process, when we've taken them through a process of guided reflection, the third quote comes from that. And the second quote was an early reflection, you see focus group 3, and the third quote comes from the same focus group. I think for me, it is just accepting that I'm human, and I will react emotionally if I'm confronted with an emotional kind of situation. So I'm a mother and I'm a doctor, but a mother as well. And I will give my patient a hug and let them lie on my couch if they are very stressed. And for me, that is okay. I think that is part of caring. I think that is being part of a doctor and showing you care and knowing someone cares. Now, this quote comes from the same cohort that at the beginning of the 10-month research period was saying that they were feeling overwhelmed, hollow, their work was meaningless, they were just pushing the numbers. When they started experiencing, when they started thinking and changing their perspective around engaging with patients on a deeper level, they started coming out with this completely different experience. There was a qualitative change that happened at some point during that 10-month period. When we reflected on it in the deductive process, we could actually identify almost exactly, we could pinpoint where that qualitative change happened in a cumulative manner across the 10-month period. And this quote describes it in a little bit more detail from a transformative learning perspective. And this quote contains almost all the elements about that we want to have within, to be able to say confidently that we can describe a transformative learning framework from the data. There's an element of reflection. There's an element of discussion and planning. And then there's an element where the person reports what they did post-experimentation, and I'll outline that process in a few minutes. And then the last line is quite telling, because the person says, I think from doing it and seeing the benefit, I need to do it. So that needing to do it indicated in the context of this conversation that they wouldn't feel as if their job was done if they didn't approach their clinical encounters with this expanded vision of the relationships with the patients, which included a strong emotional component. And then the third cohort that we explored was that of educators. And here we need to recognize that even in our roles as clinician educators, there is a level of vulnerability of our own, and the recognition that our clinicians are vulnerable. And so there was some overlap between what the students reported about them being docile bodies and what the clinician educators reported in the sense that the system is often quite constricting, particularly in the state sector, with protocols. Now, I mean, I think any of us that have been working in the state sector understand that protocols are very important. And we're not going to walk away from that conversation. But there's a lived experience of working within a highly protocolized environment where it seems as if it takes the person away from their sense of purpose in terms of the clinical care that they're delivering. Just food for thought for us who are in this role as clinician educators. So when I sat down and looked at all of these findings, and you can appreciate that they were quite a mouthful, and I've only given you maybe 5% of maybe less of what the data sets we're looking at. So I'm going to extrapolate from data sets into this reflective process. There were 3 key elements that came out of that. What's the educational potential of suffering or vulnerability as a pivoting tool in building this intersubjective bridge? If you think about intersubjectivity, we have patients who have a subjective experience of the encounter. We have clinicians who have their own subjective experience. And it's in that intersubjective space that we are able to build bridges, that space that exists between people, that we are able to build bridges. There have been other people who have written about it, and I think McWhinney writes quite strongly about this intersubjective space, and he writes about the subjective experience of illnesses that the patient has, and how the family physician needs to tune into that subjective experience of illness. Sister Hellman, who was a South African GP who settled in London in the 1980s and went on to become one of the early medical anthropologists, speaks about cultural expressions of illness. And once again, illness then takes on a different meaning. We as clinicians need to strive to understand that cultural expression of illness to be able to understand what the illness means. And then the medical health and humanities literature has given kind of a central role to suffering in the human condition. And I find it mind-boggling that if we look at the literature, the medical literature, we speak very little to the notion of suffering, vulnerability, and subjective aspects of illness. I borrowed from outside of the medical literature to look at emotions in the intersubjective space. Emotions are essentially what holds that subjective space, gives it reality. I don't think any of us can deny the reality of emotions, even though within a particular Cartesian worldview, we want to maybe suppress the role that emotions play in decision-making. But Wahbi Long was a clinical psychologist, associate dean of humanities on Upper Campus, speaks about emotions as being essential to animate social engagement. It describes this unanimous feeling of euphoria when we go to watch Banyana play and score a goal against Italy, the winning goal right at the end of the match. And every South African heart, without being told to reacted spontaneously. And it's that social engagement that gets animated through this emotion that we can't deny. Similarly, you know, when we lost in the Netball World Cup to Uganda, we all felt this collective sense of loss. Nobody primed us for that. Nobody told us to all feel like that. It animated our social engagement. And why is this quite important? I used teachings from Nussbaum, who's a political theorist, who spoke about how emotions, in a book which is called Political Emotions, how emotions are important because they provide the energy for action. Her argument is that even in a modern world, the ultimate emotion that should generate right action is love. And so within the context of the clinician-patient encounter, what are the emotions which we should be aware of, and hence we as educators should we teach about within the space? How do we prepare our students who are clinicians in the future to navigate this space? Or do we just assume that they have these skills already? And then the third key issue that emerged was this story of power analysis in the clinical encounter. Patient being an active member of the therapeutic team. So when I reflected on these three key elements, power, vulnerability, critical awareness, interconnectedness, and transformed perspectives needed to find a way to express itself in health sciences education. And if you think about this through the lens that I had set myself, which was a lens constructed from power, Ubuntu, and transformative learning, I made two key proposals. There were other proposals, but I'm presenting two key proposals to this group today. The proposal one is that within health science education, there needs to be epistemological generosity as normative practice. Now, what this means is, if you look at the right-hand side of the slide in front of you, you'll see that our biomedical knowledge has generally emerged from within a positivist knowledge system, which comes from the pathologies, from chemistry, from clinical experience, and from radiology. You'll notice that those sciences, except for the clinical, probably not more than 130 years old. The clinical is obviously much older than that. But the positive sciences has given us what we know about pharmacology, what we know about the germ theory, what we know about TB, HIV, etc. Very, very useful and quite important. It's empirical science. It can be generalizable. It's reproducible. And oftentimes, the outcome is that there's a cure for the required illness. What I'm arguing for is that alongside this positivist approach, we need to have this constructivist approach. And in our context, an Ubuntu-inspired humanist approach could be something that we can consider. I've provided some evidence for that. The advantage of the constructivist approach, in addition to the positivist approach, when we're thinking about relationships which are social constructs and hence heavily influenced by contextual factors, it's context rich. It would be mutually beneficial if considered alongside a positivist approach, and would always be culturally appropriate. And so we could end up, if we could consider ourselves to be generous enough from a philosophical perspective, with an educational system that produces professionals who are able to cure and able to care. And the two would not be mutually exclusive, they would be beneficial to each other. The second proposal, which is a little bit more detailed, speaks to this method of teaching about clinician-patient relationships, and it's unashamedly inspired by ideas which emanate from Ubuntu, the sacredness of humanity, and the undeniability of human interconnectedness. Obviously, this flies in the face of many more modern philosophies of life, particularly from a liberal perspective, which holds that we are not necessarily as interconnected as Ubuntu claims that we are. And there are certain key areas that this pedagogy would look at. The one would be identity construction. The second would be an awareness of power. This is very important given South Africa's history and Africa's history of coloniality. And the centrality of interconnectedness across human society. And I've proposed the 6-step framework, which primarily foregrounds critical consciousness, which includes an emotional awareness. And it needs step number 2, which is a disorientating dilemma, which is experientially driven. It's not based in text primarily. We use text to learn from others' experience and inferences, but we primarily ground our learning within the context in which we find ourselves. So the tension exists within this pedagogy between text and context. And I think it's a necessary tension which needs to be evaluated quite thoroughly. And so when we find a dilemma which disorientates us, and we find that that is so disorientating that our way of seeing the world is challenged, as these students were. The traditional way of understanding clinician-patient relationships was challenged, and they needed to reimagine that collectively and individually. They started experimenting in step 4. Ongoing dialogue refined their methodology. And so they were able to then emerge with step 6, as you saw in one of the quotes, with a renewed, well-articulated worldview. Almost near the end, my voice won't allow me for much longer. And so I think it's important that we as scholars in an African context think and work very hard, individually and collectively, to produce work which is relevant and grounded in our context. This holds profound implications for decolonial medical education. If we can awaken the deep kind of philosophical foundations of African scholarship within medical education. And I think in doing so, we embrace vulnerability. We recognize that there is latent agency within each and every one of us, in our students, in our patients, within ourselves. And I think, you know, when we start considering humanization, in my thesis, I quote Freire quite extensively, and he speaks about this liberatory pedagogy, pedagogy of the oppressed. And the key intervention is to humanize those that have been oppressed, that have been on the margins of society. This humanizing part of it is recognizing vulnerability and agency, is a liberatory, revolutionary action. I leave you with those thoughts. Thank you very much. A reference list for those that would like to engage further. Thank you, class.
Thank you so much, Tasleem. And I see there's applause also coming from some of the attendees. Yeah, thank you so much. That was, I think it's always amazing how one can distill and crystallize the precious thinking from a whole PhD work in such a short session. And to really bring out the meaning and the new insights and the contributions from that is really insightful. We fortunately have time also for a few questions, and the first question is from Madeleine. Please go ahead, Madeleine. Others are also welcome to either put up your hand or pop something in the chat.
Hi, Tasleem. I'm very excited, so I had to speak. So thank you very much. This is extraordinary work. It's also work I'm very passionate about, and actually want to do a specific project in my. So it's partly I'm going to ask a little bit of advice in terms of a way forward next year, because I'm planning a project specifically around, and I've been reading up on transformative learning, which will be the perspective that I'm using. And where I'm coming from in terms of our context, so I'm at Walter Sisulu University. I've got 5th and 6th year medical students for family medicine. And I've had this question on how do I create a patient-centered doctor? And especially one of the challenges, although we say we're family medicine, they've got like a 6-week rotation with us in 6th year, which is all that we have with them, is that in family medicine with our biopsychosocial approach, it's a very doctor-centered approach. So even biopsychosocial is still our agenda, and we have all these tick boxes and all these guidelines and all these things that has to happen in the consultation. And to shift to a patient-centered, where the patient's agenda sits in the center of that consultation, being able to really listen to our patients, takes a paradigm shift, as you say, it takes a perspective shift. And for me also the question is, how do we teach that practically in my little 6 weeks that I have these students in 6 years? How do we create transformative learning in such a short period of time? And a specific aspect of that is I've been very involved in teaching gender affirming healthcare. So I'm in the Eastern Cape. It's a very conservative, traditional, cultural, religious area. And now I am trying to look at how do you provide services for people who are transgender or gender diverse. And there you really work with is, how do I affirm my patient's experience? How do I make my patient feel safe enough? I love that I can tell my doctor anything. So as a doctor, can I create students where any patient, regardless of their identity, orientation, background, culture, can feel completely safe to talk to their doctor about all the stuff that goes on for them? And that's a huge ask in a way on how we teach that, because we all come from our little cultural backgrounds or where we grow up. And so I've really been battling with this question and how we do that. And one of the things that I've been struggling with is Meziro's idea of the disorientating dilemma. So I get that, but now I've got my students. How do I now create disorientating dilemmas in a 6 weeks rotation? And what I think I found really useful out of your work is this idea of the suffering. So working with this reflective process actively, and actually every consultation, when you work with people that suffer, you can potentially use reflection in a way to create mini disorientating dilemmas, be able to step a little bit into somebody's shoes, into that vulnerability that you yourself feel if you're dealing with somebody that's from a completely different religion or value system than yourself, and that tension that it creates, then being able to reflect on that tension. So looking forward, what I'm looking at next year is a way to try also, and I'll contact you separately in terms of how we're going to have some sort of baseline in terms of an assessment. I'm probably not going to be able to do a heavy qualitative thing, but where are my students at the beginning of their 5th or 6th year? And then I need to look at an intervention, and this is where the question comes from. So I've already been playing with the idea of reflection and using media, and it has to fit in with my current curriculum. I can't take it outside of, can't do anything grand. And how do we create small opportunities? So a little bit that thing of how do we create an intervention? And then being able to see at the end of the year whether we actually shifting paradigms. And I love these experiences, that I love that idea of the humanizing, that the student themselves discovering that when I am humanizing, when I do affirm my patient, when I do really listen, when I create that opening, obviously your patients are so amazing in how they give back when you do that. And that in itself suddenly makes you feel like you're a doctor and you've got agency in those moments. So thank you very much. Very inspired. And yes, any idea of what you'd like me to do with my students next year would be very appreciated.
Thanks, Madeleine. Yeah, so I don't think I can answer you. It took us 10 months to document this process, and now you're asking about 6 weeks. That's right. It would be an interesting experiment whether 6 weeks is sufficient to document a truly transformative learning process. I don't know. The difficulty about the disorientating dilemma is not so much having the dilemma. It's about how do you resolve the dilemma. So it's the resolution of the dilemma which is wherein the learning lies. And is 6 weeks enough? Do you have enough contact with your students within a 6-week period to help them safely resolve? Remember that a dilemma, when you're talking about deep perceptual shifts, is something which challenges the student's worldview. You certainly don't want to be in a position where you find that they have unraveled the existing worldview within the time that they've had with you, and you haven't had time to almost put them back together. There's lots of puzzle pieces, and you can't anticipate how complicated that process is, because if you don't have deep knowledge of your students, and you know that you're not going to have a long time with them. So it's almost something that I would caution to say there needs to be some type of longer term. Maybe if you decided to set up a research cohort of a particular group of students, you would then, as part of the research process, need to maintain some type of longitudinal contact with them. Because in many instances, it was quite a distressing, becoming aware of their own vulnerability in their day-to-day work. It's quite a distressing thing for some students, especially for those who didn't have kind of spaces outside of the professional space where they could reflect honestly, talk about their fears, etc. So I think just be a little bit cautious about just, the university system is very much like a conveyor belt. 6 weeks, move on another 6 weeks, move on another 6 weeks. If we're talking about humanizing, we've also got to humanize that space. It's not a natural kind of thing for us just to move in this mechanistic way from one thing to the next. So one almost got to be a little bit of a maverick in the system and say, well, I want to do this, but I'm not going to be mechanistic about how I do it. It's there are some limits, obviously, in terms of your time and your time resources, but you've got to accept that kind of we evolve in our thought patterns as human beings in a much slower way than it takes to learn some facts which student can regurgitate in the exam.
So yeah, thank you. I don't want to take too much time, but I think that's one of the things I've been shying away from the disorientating dilemma in the 6 weeks, because you're right, it's not safe enough. And my problem is also the students are looked after by lots of different facilitators. Mm. So I can't be the only one that's looking after them, and not everybody has the ability to carry that space. Mm. So I've been looking more just raising a bit of awareness and consciousness and understanding how emotions and behavior, and working with and fixed mindsets, and looking at using media and comedy, actually. Anyway, this is all the experimentation. But I like the idea that we follow the cohort through, even if we have monthly, 1 hour a month, just contact space to touch in. But this is the question. We can't rewrite our curriculums at the moment. And I agree with you. The problem we're trying to create doctors, but the internal medicine block and the anesthetics block actually almost dehumanizes, undoes all the good that we do in family medicine. Sorry if I'm offending any of the other disciplines. So but I would love to, I'll have some more bilaterals with you on that while I try and get my head around what we're going to try and do next year, and find something that, even if it just ups the consciousness a little bit, if we can't do the full transformation. But wonderful work. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tasleem and Marlene. I don't know if you're seeing in the chat, but there's quite a lot of contributions that resonate with this conversation around disorientating dilemmas, the value of home visits, and also the potential of longitudinal projects, to especially from a like you say, a regular reflective dialogue between the various stakeholders that have been mentioned. I don't know if you have any remarks on that, Tasleem, or I don't know, you probably haven't had a chance to engage with it at this stage.
Yeah. I'm just looking, and I think one of the comments that Steve made in the chat is that when I said we could pinpoint some of the key kind of educational interventions, one of the things was doing a home visit, where the students were required to do a home visit, but it wasn't just a home visit in a community of their choice. They were all placed in underserved communities, and so it was literally a traversing of those barriers that we spoke about earlier, the socioeconomic barriers. Oftentimes there were still ongoing language and cultural barriers, but students came back and reported that seeing the reality of where patients lived in damp shacks, in multi-family homes, in unfurnished spaces, very powerful ways of disorientating them out of just being biomedically centered within the facility. So there are ways of doing it, but as I said, the key learning happens in the reflective space. Thanks.
I don't see any more hands.
Klaus, thanks everyone.
I think we can probably conclude at this point, and thanks again, Tasleem, and also to all the attendees. We really value your time and your engagement with the seminar. The recording of the seminar will also be available on our departmental YouTube channel. Yeah, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. And thanks, Tasleem, for showing the work that you're doing and leading the direction on this particular educational field. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon and be safe.